All right, so today we're diving into some pretty fascinating stuff about the Philippine-American War.
Yeah, really interesting stuff.
But we're kind of moving past the battlefield itself and into the years after when things get a little messy.
Right. Yeah, exactly. A lot of people know about the big battles and everything, but what came after is really important for understanding how things played out long term.
Totally. And we're basing this deep dive on an episode of the American History Tellers podcast.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to check that out.
Yeah, great podcast.
Yeah. So we're talking about political maneuvering and defiant acts and the really early struggles of Filipino immigrants to America.
Yeah, it's a period that's often overlooked, but it's crucial to understanding, the war's lasting impact.
For sure, for sure. So where do we even begin with all of this?
Well, I think a good place to start is with William Howard Taft.
Okay. Yeah.
The big guy who became the governor of the Philippines in 1902.
Yeah, I remember him from history class.
Right. So he was all about this idea of benevolent assimilation.
Oh, yeah, I remember that term.
Right. But the podcast reveals that privately, he held some pretty conflicting views.
Really? So it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows?
No, not exactly.
Okay.
Publicly, he presented this image of wanting to help the Filipinos.
Right.
But privately, he believed they needed guidance, possibly for a century or more.
Wow, I sent
He
you.
even advocated for permanent U.S. control at one point.
So much for benevolent, right?
Right, exactly. It makes you question the whole concept of benevolent assimilation, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Like, how can it be truly benevolent if the people being assimilated have no say in the matter?
Right. It's a really important question to consider.
Yeah, and remember, Filipinos had just fought for independence from Spain.
Exactly. They were ready for self-governance.
And then the U.S. comes in and says, not so fast.
Right. And this paternalistic attitude was really evident in the massive push for American-style education.
Oh, yeah. They sent over tons of American teachers, right?
Thousands.
Yeah.
The goal was to reshape Filipino society
Wow.
in the image of America.
To Americanize them, basically.
Yeah. Basically teaching them American history and civics.
In a country that's yearning for its own identity.
Exactly. It's bound to create some tension, isn't
And
it?
for sure. It's like they were trying to create a mini America in the Pacific.
Right. But of course, you can't just erase a people's history and culture that easily.
No. And that clash of ideologies leads to some incredible acts of defiance.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, what about Aurelio Tolentino and his play Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow?
Tolentino. He was a firebrand.
Sounds like.
His play was incredibly controversial.
Why is that?
Well, there was this scene where the lead actor was supposed to trample on the American flag,
Oh, wow.
but he refused to do it.
Really?
So Tolentino himself stepped in, grabbed the flag, and threw it down on the stage.
No way he did.
Oh, he did. It caused a huge uproar, landed him in prison, of course.
Of course, it's a scene straight out of a movie.
It was a powerful statement, though.
Absolutely. What do you think was going through his mind in that moment?
I think he understood the power of symbolism. Yeah. The American flag represented more than just a piece of cloth to Filipinos at that time.
Right. It was a symbol of oppression.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And his actions resonated with a lot of people.
Yeah. It takes a lot of courage to stand up like that.
It really does. And he wasn't the only one. There's also the story of Clemensia Lopez.
Oh, yeah. I read a little about her. What was her story again?
Her brother Sixto was exiled for advocating for independence,
Oh, right.
and she traveled all the way to the U.S. to fight for his release.
Wow. All the way from the Philippines.
Yeah, she was determined to make her voice heard.
That's incredible. What did she do when she got to the U.S.?
She spoke at the New England Women's Suffrage Association.
Really?
Yeah, she connected the fight for Filipino independence to the fight for women's rights.
That's a powerful connection.
It is. It shows how the struggle for equality transcends borders.
Absolutely. So was she successful in getting her brother released?
Well, it's complicated. The legal situation at the time was really messy.
How so?
The Supreme Court had issued these rulings called the insular cases.
Okay, I'm not familiar with those.
Basically, they created a separate legal system for Filipinos in U.S. territories.
So they weren't given full constitutional rights?
Exactly.
Wow, that's messed up.
It was a way for the U.S. to maintain control while still claiming to be benevolent.
Yeah, that benevolence is starting to wear thin.
Right. Clemencia knew she was facing an uphill battle, but she didn't give up.
What did she do?
She challenged stereotypes about Filipinos. She demanded recognition for their rights.
Good for her.
Yeah, she was a real trailblazer, and when she returned to the Philippines, she founded the Philippine Feminist Association.
Wow, so she was a feminist pioneer, too.
Absolutely. Her actions laid the groundwork for future Filipino-American involvement in social justice movements.
It's amazing how one person can make such a difference.
It really is. And while she was fighting for Filipino rights in the U.S., Taft's benevolent assimilation was facing some serious challenges back in the Philippines.
Oh, right. Like what?
Well, in 1902, a cholera epidemic hit the islands.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it was devastating. Killed an estimated 200,000 Filipinos.
Wow, that's a huge number.
It was a major crisis, and it really exposed the limitations of Taft's approach.
How so?
Well, despite his efforts to improve infrastructure and sanitation, the colonial government just wasn't equipped to handle a crisis of that magnitude.
Right, so even with good intentions, things can still go horribly wrong.
Exactly. And it really made people question whether American rule truly had their best interests at heart.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
And did the resistance to American rule continue during this time?
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
And in response to this resistance, Taft empowered the constabulary.
What?
Constabulary. It was a police force that often used brutal tactics.
So basically a tool for suppressing dissent.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
And it just furthered the cycle of violence.
It's like no matter how good the intentions are, the colonial power structure just breeds conflict.
Yeah, it's a difficult situation. And in the midst of all this turmoil and violence, we have the story of Apolinario Mabini.
Oh, yeah, he was called the brains of the revolution, wasn't he?
That's right. He was a brilliant strategist and writer.
But what happened to him after the war?
He was exiled to Guam for his role in the rebellion.
Wow, exiled all the way to Guam.
Yeah, it was a tiny island in the middle of the Pacific.
That's rough. So was he just silenced then?
Not at all.
Yeah.
Even in exile, Mabini continued to write.
Really?
Oh, yeah. His writings were smuggled back into the Philippines.
Wow, so he was still a thorn in the side of the American government?
Very much so.
Oh.
And when he was finally allowed to return to the Philippines, he was still unwavering in his commitment to independence.
What do you mean?
Well, the podcast describes this scene where a journalist visits Mabini at his home
Okay.
and finds him living in poverty by the Pasig River.
Wow, so even after everything he'd been through, he still refused to compromise his ideals.
Exactly. He was offered a government job, but he refused it.
Why is that?
He knew that taking the job would mean having to stay silent.
So he chose integrity over comfort.
Exactly. Mabini's legacy is one of unwavering commitment to his principles.
It's really inspiring.
He died shortly after returning home, likely from cholera.
Oh, wow, that's sad.
It is. But his words continue to inspire generations of Filipinos.
It's amazing how powerful ideas can be.
You really can. And Mabini's story reminds us that resistance can take many forms.
Yeah, from armed struggle to artistic expression to simply refusing to be silenced.
Exactly. And this brings us to another chapter in the struggle for Philippine independence,
Yeah.
a conflict that often gets overlooked.
You're talking about the Moro Wars, right?
That's right. The U.S. found itself embroiled in a new conflict in the southern Philippines.
This time with the Muslim and indigenous groups of Mindanao.
Right. The Moro people had their own distinct culture and traditions.
And they weren't about to just submit to American rule.
Exactly. The Moro Wars highlight the limits of the U.S.'s understanding of the Philippines.
What do you mean?
Well, they applied this one-size-fits-all approach to colonial rule.
Right.
They didn't take into account the deep cultural and religious differences within the archipelago.
So they basically underestimated the Moro people's resistance.
They did. And the podcast mentions Taft's visit to Mindanao in 1905.
He came away with a very dismissive view of the Moro people.
Really? What did he say?
He labeled them as warlike and incapable of self-government.
Wow.
And just a year later, American forces carried out a horrific massacre on the island of Jolo.
A massacre?
Yeah, they killed hundreds of Moro people, including women and children.
Oh my God, that's terrible.
It was a brutal act of violence. And there was a public outcry in the U.S.,
I bet there was.
especially after a photograph of the trench filled with bodies was published.
I can't even imagine.
It was a shocking image. But despite the outrage, the conflict dragged on for years.
So another example of the U.S.'s messy and complex approach to colonialism.
Exactly. And all of this turmoil and uncertainty created the backdrop for a new wave of Filipino migration to the U.S.
Right, driven by labor needs in the U.S. and the allure of the American dream.
Exactly. And one of the most compelling examples of this experience is the story of Carlos Bulosan.
Carlos Bulosan.
Yeah, he was a teenager who arrived in Seattle in 1930 full of hopes and dreams.
So he was educated in American schools in the Philippines. He was. And he believed in the promise of freedom and opportunity.
But America didn't exactly roll out the red carpet for him, did it?
No, not at all. He faced immense challenges, discrimination, exploitation.
So his experience was a far cry from the American dream he'd been taught about.
It was. But his story is a powerful lens through which to examine the contradictions at the heart of the U.S.-Philippines relationship during this period.
What do you mean?
Well, the U.S. was promoting American ideals and education,
Right.
while simultaneously exploiting Filipino labor and denying them full citizenship rights.
It's a paradox that continues to shape Filipino-American identity today.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
So let's dive into Bilosan's world and explore his journey from that hopeful arrival in Seattle to the harsh realities he faced as a migrant worker in America.
Okay, I'm ready when you are.
All right, so Bilosan arrives in Seattle Harbor,
Yeah.
a young man full of dreams and aspirations. He'd been educated in those American schools back in the Philippines,
Right.
and he truly believed in the promise of America, the land of opportunity. But the America he found was harsh and unforgiving.
Yeah, I bet. He was a Filipino immigrant during a time of widespread racism and prejudice.
Exactly, and his memoir, America is in the Heart, lays bare those grueling realities he faced.
Like, what kinds of things did he go through?
He worked in the Alaskan canneries.
Oh, wow.
Imagine the conditions up there.
Yeah, brutal.
He picked apples in Washington state, traveled up and down the West Coast following those harvest seasons,
Just to find work.
just to survive,
Yeah.
And it wasn't just the backbreaking labor, it was the constant feeling of being an outsider.
Right, being treated as less than.
Exactly. He was denied service in restaurants, barred from certain neighborhoods, subjected to racial slurs constantly,
Just because he was Filipino.
just because he was Filipino.
Yeah.
And the podcast even mentions a horrifying incident where he was attacked by a white mob.
Oh, no.
Yeah, in San Jose, she barely escaped with his life.
It's a reminder of the violence and hostility so many immigrants, particularly people of color, have faced throughout American history.
It is, and it's a stark reminder of the systemic nature of racism in America.
Right. It wasn't just isolated incidents.
It was a system designed to keep certain groups of people marginalized and disenfranchised.
And all of this was happening during the Great Depression.
Right, a time of widespread economic hardship.
So competition for jobs was fierce.
Incredibly fierce, and anti-immigrant sentiment was rampant.
So how did Bilosan even survive all of this?
It's a testament to his resilience.
Yeah, I mean, how did he hold on to hope amidst such adversity?
I think he found solace in writing.
Oh, right, he was a writer.
He was, and he continued to educate himself.
So he never stopped learning.
Never. And he became a vocal advocate for the rights of his fellow workers.
So he didn't just focus on his own struggles.
No, he understood that collective action was necessary to overcome oppression.
What did he do?
Well, in 1939, he co-founded the Filipino Agricultural Labor Association,
Okay.
a pioneering organization that fought for better working conditions for Filipino farm workers.
Oh, wow, so he was a labor organizer too.
He was. And his work paved the way for future generations of activists.
That's incredible. So even though he faced so much hardship, he still found a way to make a difference.
He did. And his story is a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope and resistance can flourish.
It's a powerful message for sure. So while Bilosan was navigating those harsh realities in America back in the Philippines, the movement for independence continued?
It did. And in 1934, the U.S. Congress finally passed the Tidings-McDuffie Act.
Okay, and what did that do?
It promised the Philippines independence within a decade.
Wow, so after decades of struggle, they were finally going to get their freedom.
It seemed that way, but there were some strings attached.
What do you mean strings attached?
Well, the U.S. wasn't willing to relinquish control entirely.
Okay, so what were these strings?
Well, the Tidings-McDuffie Act included this thing called the Parity Amendment.
The Parity Amendment. Okay, what's that?
Basically, it granted American businesses special rights and privileges in the Philippine economy.
So even though the Philippines was getting political independence, they were still going to be economically dependent on the U.S.
Exactly. And on top of that, the Military Bases Agreement allowed the U.S. to maintain military bases in the Philippines.
For how long?
For 99 years.
99 years. Wow. So even though they were getting independence, the U.S. was making sure they could still exert their influence.
Absolutely. It raised a lot of questions about the true nature of Philippine sovereignty.
Right. So it was kind of a bittersweet victory.
It was. And it created a lasting legacy of dependence that the Philippines is still dealing with today.
It's a complicated history for sure. So in 1946, the Philippines finally gained independence.
They did, after a long and difficult struggle.
I wonder what happened to Emilio Aguinaldo after all of that.
Oh, Aguinaldo. He had a fascinating journey after the war.
What did he do?
Well, he actually ran for president of the newly independent Philippines in 1935.
Really? So he went from leading the resistance to trying to lead the country.
He did, but he lost the election to Manuel Quezon.
Oh, wow. So what did he do after that?
For many years, he remained relatively silent about the war.
Really?
But in 1957, He published a book.
Oh, what was it called?
It was called A Second Look at America.
Interesting title.
It was. And in the book, he claimed that the U.S. had betrayed him and the Filipino people.
He felt like they had gone back on their word.
Exactly. He said he felt caught by the accident of history.
That's a powerful statement. It speaks to the complexities and contradictions of that period.
It really does. And his reflections highlight the lasting impact of the war on the Filipino psyche.
Yeah, a sense of betrayal and disillusionment.
Absolutely. And his story also complicates the narrative of Filipino resistance.
No, so.
Well, he initially cooperated with the U.S., believing they would grant full independence.
Right.
But when that didn't happen, he led the armed rebellion against them.
So he was constantly navigating a treacherous political landscape.
He was. And his later reflections reveal the personal toll of those historical events.
I can only imagine. So did he ever come to terms with what happened?
He eventually did. He accepted the role the U.S. played in the Philippines.
Really?
Yeah, he said, we were all caught by the accident of history.
It's a reminder that history is never simple.
It's not. And Aguinaldo's life spanned the entire period, from Spanish colonialism to Philippine independence.
Wow, so he witnessed firsthand all of those tumultuous changes.
He did. And his story is really a microcosm of the Philippines' own journey.
It's a powerful story for sure. So what about Carles Bulosan? Did he ever get to return to the Philippines?
Sadly, he didn't. He died in Seattle in 1956.
Oh no, how old was he?
He was only 43.
Wow, way too young. What happened?
He died from tuberculosis.
Oh, that's heartbreaking. So he never made it back to his homeland?
No, he didn't.
Yeah.
And he was never granted American citizenship either.
Really? Even after all he did for Filipino workers in America?
Even after all he did. It's a tragic irony.
It is. But his memoir, America is in the Heart, became a powerful testament to the struggles and aspirations of the Filipino immigrant experience.
It did, and it continues to resonate with readers today.
It's a story that speaks to the complexities of identity and belonging and the ongoing pursuit of a more just and equitable world.
It does. And Bulosan's voice is one that deserves to be heard.
Absolutely. So I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have, and it's just a glimpse into a really complex and fascinating period of history.
Yeah, there's so much more to explore.
There is, and I encourage everyone to delve deeper into the stories of those who lived through these times.
Absolutely. And if you're looking for a good place to start, I highly recommend Carles Bulosan's America is in the Heart.
It's a powerful and moving read.
Okay, so we're going to take a break here, but when we come back, we'll dive even deeper into Bulosan's story and explore the lasting legacy of the Philippine-American War. He arrives in Seattle, all bright-eyed, ready for a new life.
Yeah, and he really believed in that American dream, the one he'd learned about back home.
But the reality was a lot harsher.
Oh, yeah, way harsher. I mean, Bulosan, he experienced the worst of it.
The racism, the exploitation, can you imagine?
It's hard to fathom he worked in those Alaskan canneries.
Oh, God, yeah, those were brutal.
Back-breaking work, long hours, terrible conditions.
And then he traveled down the coast picking apples in Washington, doing whatever he could to get by.
Exactly, just scraping by and always facing that prejudice,
That feeling of being an outsider.
Always on the outside looking in.
And it wasn't just the work, it was the constant threat of violence.
The podcast mentioned that attack by the mob in San Jose.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. Terrifying.
It's just horrifying. And that wasn't an isolated incident?
No, not at all. So many immigrants, especially people of color, faced that kind of hostility.
Absolutely. It's a stain on American history.
It really is. And what's striking is that even with all that hardship, Bulosan, he never gave up.
He had this incredible resilience, this belief in something better.
Yeah. How do you think he managed to hold on to that hope?
Well, he was a writer, and I think writing was his outlet, his way of processing everything he was going through.
So he channeled that pain into his art.
Exactly. Yeah. And he never stopped learning. He was always reading, always trying to better himself.
And he didn't just focus on his own struggles.
No, he was deeply committed to helping others.
What did he do?
Well, he became involved in labor organizing.
Okay.
And in 1939, he helped found the Filipino Agricultural Labor Association.
That's incredible. He was fighting for better working conditions for his fellow Filipinos.
Exactly. He knew that they had to stand together to fight for their rights.
So he was a real trailblazer.
He was a true pioneer. His work really laid the groundwork for future farm worker movements.
Wow. So even though he faced so much adversity, he still found a way to make a positive impact.
He did. And his story is a testament to the power of one person to make a difference.
Absolutely inspiring. So while Bulosan was fighting for his rights in America back in the Philippines, things were finally starting to move towards independence.
They were in 1934. The U.S. Congress passed the Tidings-McDuffie Act.
Okay, and remind me, what did that do again?
It promised the Philippines independence, but there was a catch.
A catch? What do you mean?
Well, it wasn't exactly a clean break, you see.
So the U.S. wasn't just going to walk away?
No, they weren't. The act included something called the Parity Amendment.
Parity Amendment?
Yeah, basically it gave American businesses special privileges in the Philippine economy.
Ah, so they were ensuring their economic dominance even after granting independence.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there was the military bases agreement.
Oh boy, that doesn't sound good.
It allowed the U.S. to keep military bases in the Philippines
For how long?
for 99 years.
99 years. That's almost a century. So it wasn't really true independence then, was it?
It was a complicated situation. It raised all these questions about sovereignty and neocolonialism.
So it was a bittersweet victory at best.
Absolutely. And it created a legacy of dependence that the Philippines is still grappling with today.
Yeah, it's a reminder that decolonization is a complex process.
Very complex, and it's often messy and fraught with challenges.
So 1946 rolls around and the Philippines finally gets its independence.
It does, after a long and arduous struggle.
It makes you wonder what Emilio Aguinaldo thought about it all.
Oh, Aguinaldo. He had a fascinating journey after the war.
What did he do?
Well, he actually ran for president of the newly independent Philippines.
Really?
He did in 1935, but he lost to Manuel Quezon.
So he went from revolutionary leader to politician.
Yeah, it's an interesting turn of events.
It is. So what did he do after losing the election?
Well, he stayed out of the limelight for a while.
Kind of retreated from public life?
Yeah, but then in 1957, he published a book.
Oh, what was it about?
It was called A Second Look at America.
Interesting title.
And in it, he basically accused the U.S. of betraying him and the Filipino people.
So he felt like they had promised him one thing and then done another?
Exactly. He felt like they had used him and then cast him aside.
Wow, that's a pretty serious accusation.
It is, and it really highlights the sense of disillusionment that many Filipinos felt after the war.
So even though they had achieved independence, there were still these lingering feelings of resentment and betrayal.
Absolutely. And Aguinaldo's story also complicates the narrative of Filipino resistance.
How so?
Well, he initially cooperated with the Americans.
Right. He thought they were going to help him liberate the Philippines.
Exactly. But when he realized that wasn't the case, he turned against them.
So he was caught between two worlds.
He was, and his later writings show how much that struggle weighed on him.
So did he ever find peace with it all?
Eventually, he seemed to come to terms with the role the U.S. played in the Philippines.
Really?
Yeah. He famously said, "We were all caught by the accident of history."
It's a powerful statement.
It is. It acknowledges the complexity of the situation and the forces beyond their control.
So even though he felt betrayed, he was able to find some kind of acceptance.
I think so. And his story is really a microcosm of the Philippines' own journey to independence.
It's a reminder that history is never black and white.
It's full of shades of gray, and sometimes it's hard to tell the heroes from the villains.
So what about Carlos Bulosan? Did he ever get to go back to the Philippines?
Sadly, he didn't. He died in Seattle in 1956.
Oh, wow. He was so young.
He was only 43.
What happened?
He died from tuberculosis.
Oh, that's so tragic.
It was. He never got to see his homeland again.
And to think he never even got American citizenship after all those years of fighting for the rights of Filipino workers?
It's a cruel irony, isn't it?
That really is. But his legacy lives on through his writing.
Absolutely. America is in the Heart is a powerful testament to the struggles and aspirations of the Filipino immigrant experience.
It's a book that everyone should read.
I agree. It's a story that speaks to the heart of the American dream and the complexities of identity and belonging.
It's a reminder that even in the face of adversity, hope and resilience can prevail.
And it's a challenge to us to create a more just and equitable world for everyone.
It's incredible, isn't it, to think about those individuals, Mabini, Tolentino, Clemensia Lopez. I mean, they were up against so much.
It's really inspiring how they never gave up.
Limited resources, constant pressure, yet they still managed to make a huge impact.
Their commitment to their ideals was unwavering.
Exile, imprisonment, social isolation, it didn't stop them.
It's a reminder that history isn't just about big events and famous leaders.
Right.
It's also about the countless individuals who fought for what they believed in.
Exactly. And their stories often get overlooked.
Yeah, we tend to focus on the benevolent assimilation narrative from the American perspective.
But we need to hear those voices of resistance, too.
Absolutely. The voices of those who challenged those assumptions and fought for a different future.
And that's where Bilosin's work comes in.
Right, America is in the heart,
Mm.
gives us a glimpse into the lived experiences of those who migrated to the U.S.
It shows us the harsh realities they face.
The racism, the exploitation, the struggles they endured,
It challenges that romanticized version of the American dream.
and forces us to confront the systemic inequalities that still exist today.
So it's not just about understanding the past,
It's about connecting the past to the present.
and understanding how that history continues to shape the Filipino-American community today.
Exactly. The Filipino-American community is so diverse, and their experiences are shaped by multiple waves of migration.
Each with their own unique stories and challenges.
And their relationship with the U.S. is complex and multifaceted.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you really hope our listeners take away from all of this?
I think the most important question to consider is, how did the Philippine-American War and the subsequent waves of migration shape what it means to be Filipino-American today?
That's a great question.
What did these stories tell us about the complexities of belonging, the strength of resilience, and the ongoing pursuit of justice and equality?
It's a question that deserves further exploration.
Absolutely, and I encourage everyone to seek out the stories of Filipino Americans.
Read their books, watch their films, listen to their music.
Engage with their art and their activism.
Learn about their history and their culture.
And for those looking for a starting point, I highly recommend Carlos Bilosin's America is in the Heart.
It's a powerful and moving book.
It will stay with you long after you finish reading it.
So on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the Philippine-American War.
We've covered a lot of ground, but there's always more to learn.
So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into the rich tapestry of history.
Thanks for joining us.
And until next time, happy listening.